Hey Kipsters, glad you guys are back. We're listening to chapters 14 and 15 today in Fantastic Mr. Fox. We're going to find out more about the Fox's plan to host the big feast and see if we meet any new characters today. I'm glad you guys are here and I'm excited to get started. All right, friends, before we jump into chapters 14 and 15, I want to make sure we all understand what's going on in the story so far. So we know that Mr. Fox has this problem, and his problem has grown throughout the story. Currently, he's focused on getting his family fed, and he's also decided to include Badger and other animals in his family's feast. They've also now visited Bogus's and Bunce's farms and collected chickens, ducks, and vegetables for their feast. So when I was thinking about what's happened so far, I really felt like Mr. Fox's plan is going to work, and it seems like his friends agree with him. But I started thinking about Mr. Fox and how he's taking care of his family by taking things from the farmers. Normally, if I read a story about a character taking something from someone, I would think that character was like the bad guy in the story. When I thought about that and then thought about this story, I think the farmers are actually the bad guys, the antagonist, the ones who we should go against. Because in the story, they're gross and mean and they're just not very smart. Mr. Fox seems like he's the protagonist or the good guy in the story, but he is taking food that doesn't belong to him. What do you guys think? Today, Badger is going to think about the same question in our chapter. I'm curious to see what he thinks about the situation. At the end of chapter 14 today, we're going to reflect on whether or not we think Fox is making the best choices. We have two new vocabulary words today in chapter 14. The first word is the word respectable. If you describe someone as being respectable, you are regarded by other people as being good and correct. The second word is doubt. If you have doubt, you have feelings of being uncertain or being unsure about something. Our two words for today are respectable and doubt. Kind of like I was describing earlier when I was reflecting on our story, today's chapter is going to bring up a couple of different big ideas. One of the big ideas is the idea of stealing something versus borrowing something. I know that if I steal something, my plan is not to return it. If I'm borrowing something, like the kids in the library picture, I'm planning on returning it. We're also going to hear a little bit in this chapter about good versus evil or right versus wrong. I always think about the Lion King when I think about this big idea because Simba is a representation of good and Scar is a representation of evil. We'll find out today what Badger thinks about Mr. Fox and their plan. All right, we're ready to read chapter 14. Our focus today is this big question. How do Mr. Fox and Badger's opinions about taking the food different? Badger feels one way and Mr. Fox feels a different way. Let's read and find out about their two opinions. Chapter 14, Badger has doubts. Just one more visit, cried Mr. Fox, and I'll bet I know where that'll be, said the only small fox now left. He was the smallest fox of them all. Where? Said Badger. Well, said the smallest fox, we've been to Bogus and we've been to Bunce, but we haven't been to Bean. It must be Bean. You are right, said Mr. Fox, but what you don't know is which part of Bean's place we are about to visit. Which? They said both together. Aha, said Mr. Fox, just you wait and see. They were digging as they talked. The tunnel was going forward fast. Suddenly Badger said, "Doesn't this worry you a tiny bit, Foxy?" "Worry me," said Mr. Fox. "What?" "All this stealing." So we're going to pause here and look at the question on the side of the screen. What is Badger's apprehension with what Mr. Fox is doing and his plan? His apprehension means what's making him take a pause. If I'm thinking about this question, I'm noticing that this is the first time the word stealing has come up in terms of thinking about Mr. Fox and his actions of taking from the farmers. Badger sounds like he's okay with the plan, but all of a sudden he seems worried and asked Mr. Fox whether or not he feels worried too about the stealing. Badger, I think, is thinking about this in a different way now as they're headed to the third farm. Let's see if Fox has the same apprehensions as Badger. We'll keep reading. Mr. Fox stopped digging and stared at Badger as though he had gone completely dotty. "My dear old furry frump," he said, "do you know anyone in the whole world who wouldn't swipe a few chickens if his children were starving to death?" There was a short silence while Badger thought deeply about this. "You are far too respectable," said Mr. Fox. "There's nothing wrong with being respectable," Badger said. "Look," said Mr. Fox, "Bogus and Bunce and Bean are out to kill us. You realize that, I hope." "I do, Foxy, I do indeed," said the gentle Badger. "But we're not going to stoop to their level. We don't want to kill them." "I should hope not, indeed," said Badger. "We wouldn't dream of it," said Mr. Fox. "We shall simply take a little food here and there to keep us and our families alive, right?" "I suppose we'll have to," said Badger. "If they want to be horrible, let them," said Mr. Fox. "We down here are decent, peace-loving people." Badger laid his head on one side and smiled at Mr. Fox. "Foxy," he said, "I love you." "Thank you," said Mr. Fox, "and now let's get on with the digging." 5 minutes later, Badger's front paws hit against something flat and hard. "What on earth is this?" he said. "It looks like a solid stone wall." He and Mr. Fox scraped away the soil. It was a wall, but it was built of bricks, not stones. The wall was right in front of them, blocking their way. "Now, who in the world would build a wall under the ground?" asked Badger. "Very simple," said Mr. Fox. "It's the wall of an underground room, and if I'm not mistaken, it is exactly what I'm looking for." Before we continue on and find out where Badger, Mr. Fox, and the smallest fox are, let's look at these questions now that we're at the end of Chapter 14. Chapter 14 ends with these questions. First of all, how does the chapter end? The second question is, does Badger still have doubts? Press pause on your video and think about these two questions before you move on. Think about what Badger and Fox talk about at the end of this chapter and how Badger is acting and things that he says when the chapter ends. Do you think Badger still has doubts about the plan? We finished chapter 14 thinking about Badger and whether or not he still has his doubts. We know that because Badger continues to dig, he's no longer doubting Fox's plan. Fox has convinced him that what they're doing is okay and that they're just trying to save their children and their families' lives. We're going to read chapter 15 today too. The two vocabulary words for chapter 15 are ordinary and poaching. Poaching means to take something in an unfair way. Ordinary means something is normal or there's nothing special about it. The setting of this next chapter is in a cellar. Cellar is a warehouse or a storage space built under the ground. Under the ground is much cooler than above ground, so oftentimes people will build a cellar if they need to store things to keep them cool or cold. We're going to jump in to chapter 15. Today, when we finish up reading, our focus question we're going to answer is, how is the visit to the third farm different from the previous two farms? Let's get started. Chapter 15, Bean's Secret Cider Cellar. Mr. Fox examined the wall carefully. He saw that the cement between the bricks was old and crumbly, so he loosened a brick without much trouble and pulled it away. Suddenly, out from the hole where the brick had been, there popped a small, sharp face with whiskers. "Go away," it snapped. "You can't come in here. It's private." "Good Lord," said Badger, "it's Rat." "You saucy beast," said Mr. Fox. "I should have guessed we'd find you down here somewhere." Go away, shrieked Rat. Go on, beat it. This is my private pitch. Shut up, said Mr. Fox. I will not shut up, shrieked Rat. This is my place. I got here first. Mr. Fox gave a brilliant smile, flashing his white teeth. My dear Rat, he said softly, I am a hungry fellow, and if you don't hop it quickly, I shall eat you up in one gulp. That did it. Rat popped back fast out of sight. Mr. Fox laughed and began pulling more bricks out of the wall. When he had made a biggish hole, he crept through it. Badger and the smallest fox followed him in. They found themselves in a vast, damp, gloomy cellar. This is it, cried Mr. Fox. This is what? Said Badger. The place is empty. Where are the turkeys? Asked the smallest fox, staring into the gloom. I thought Bean was a turkey man. Before moving on, make sure you know who is this new character who was introduced in this chapter. Think about the answer in your brain, and let's keep reading. He is a turkey man, said Mr. Fox, but we're not after turkeys now. We've got plenty of food. Then what do we need, Dad? Take a good look round, said Mr. Fox. Don't you see anything that interests you? Badger and the smallest fox peered into the half-darkness. As their eyes became accustomed to the gloom, they began to see what looked like a whole lot of big glass jars standing upon shelves around the walls. They went closer. They were jars. There were hundreds of them, and upon each one was written the word cider. The smallest fox leaped high in the air. Oh, Dad, he cried out, look what we found. It's cider. Exactly, said Mr. Fox. Tremendous, shouted Badger. Bean's secret cider cellar, said Mr. Fox. But go carefully, my dears. Don't make a noise. This cellar is right underneath the farmhouse itself. Cider, said Badger, is especially good for badgers. We take it as medicine. 1 large glass 3 times a day with meals and another at bedtime. It will make the feast into a banquet, said Mr. Fox. While they were talking, the smallest fox had sneaked a jar off the shelf and had taken a gulp. Wow, he gasped. Wowee. Ah, gasped the smallest fox. This is some cider. That's quite enough of that, said Mr. Fox, grabbing the jar and putting it to his own lips. He took a tremendous gulp. It's miraculous, he whispered, fighting for breath. It's fabulous. It's beautiful. It's my turn, said Badger, taking the jar and tilting his head well back. The cider gurgled and bubbled down his throat. It's like melted gold, he gasped. Oh, Foxy, it's like drinking sunbeams and rainbows. You're poaching, shrieked Rat. Put that down at once. There'll be none left for me. Rat was perched upon the highest shelf in the cellar, peering out from behind a huge jar. There was a small rubber tube inserted in the neck of the jar, and Rat was using the tube to suck out the cider. Mind your own business, shrieked Rat, and if you great clumsy brutes come messing about in here, we'll all be caught. Go out and leave me to sip my cider in peace. At that moment, they heard a woman's voice calling out in the house above them. Hurry up and get that cider, Mabel, the voice called. You know Mr. Bean doesn't like to be kept waiting, especially when he's been out all night in a tent. The animals froze. They stayed absolutely still, their ears pricked, their bodies tense. Then they heard the sound of a door being opened. The door was at the top of a flight of stone steps leading down from the house to the cellar, and now someone was starting to come down those steps. So that's the end of chapter 15 and the end of our passage for today. Our end of chapter 15 question is this: what is the new problem that has come up in this chapter? When you think about what the new problem was, it should connect to how this visit to this farm is different from the previous 2 visits. Something about their visit to the 3rd farm is causing more problems for fox, badger, and the smallest fox. If you have time, write in the comments below this video and tell me what you think the problem is in chapter 15 and how the visit to this third farm was different from the other two. We're going to find out in our next video with Miss Rondo who is this someone coming down the steps.